My first guest today is Rafael Mangual. He is a senior fellow with and deputy director of legal policy at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and a contributing editor of City Journal. He's also one of my go-tos for policing criminal justice and crime. The last time we spoke, we didn't have much time, so I wanted to have him back in this format, allowing time to explain these issues in depth and offer solutions. When I discuss these topics, I normally like to start with crime because, oddly enough, most people don't mention it at all or put it last. But he wrote an interesting piece for The Hill published last week titled "The Troubling Agenda of LA's New Progressive Prosecutor and Fellow Reformers." So I started the interview by asking him to tell us about LA's new prosecutor.
Yeah, so, George Gascon was formerly the district attorney in San Francisco. He recently gave up that seat to make way for Chesa Boudin, who is sort of one of the younger up-and-comers in the progressive prosecutor movement. Like Chesa, George Gascon has a pretty radical criminal justice reform agenda, right? I mean, in like 2014, there was this big movement after, the declination to charge Darren Wilson with a crime after the shooting of Michael Brown, and the same thing with Daniel Pantaleo and Eric Gardner. The sort of progressive political apparatus really set their sights on local prosecutor offices, and it was kind of handed to them. It was a pretty brilliant strategy. And they've had a lot of success with it. So they've just been, dumping a lot of money and attention into these local DA races, where if you win that election, you can kind of unilaterally affect a lot of the criminal justice policy changes that would be a lot more difficult to get through the political process. So George Gascon recently won an election in Los Angeles and has officially taken over there. And he's got a pretty troubling agenda. Among the things that he's going to be doing is unilaterally ending cash bail. He's directing his line prosecutors to stop seeking felony enhancements for sentencing after conviction. So, in Los Angeles County, because the state has a 3 strikes law, if you get a repeat offender for whom, this is their 3rd felony conviction of a serious kind, some of those offenders are going to be eligible for much longer sentences than they would otherwise be eligible for if this was, say, their first conviction. And that gives prosecutors a tool to take really dangerous people off the street for extended periods of time. And so, Gascon is not going to be pursuing those. His office is not going to be pursuing enhancements for gang membership or habitual offender statuses, which is troubling. There's a host of offenses that his office is going to be declining to prosecute, and there's a host of other offenses for which his office is going to adopt a default position of pretrial diversion. So, no possibility of any jail time or anything like that. All of these things, are troubling to me because they're sort of blanket policies and they're being enacted unilaterally. So you're kind of undermining the political process. You're abrogating political representation, and you're applying these exceptions to a broad group of people, as opposed to making these decisions on a case-by-case basis, which is, I think, the better way to go about it.
And what I mentioned after hearing that is that the problem of radical prosecutors arbitrarily deciding which laws should be enforced and how it's dangerous. And we need to understand that it's one thing for voters to decide that they don't like the way things are going. They want their politicians to change things and do things through the legal process. Like, let's say they wanted to get rid of the 3 strikes rule. There's ways to do that. You send people to Congress who will do it. You pass laws. You move that way. But it's another thing for a prosecutor to just decide that no one with 2 felonies will be charged with a 3rd. So his way of getting rid of 3 strikes is just to never get a 3rd strike. So I asked Rafael if this is prosecutorial discretion on steroids.
Right. And look, and I don't have a problem with actual prosecutorial discretion, right? I think this is actually something of a different character. These are policies that are being enacted before any cases come before the office, right? So it's not like, one of the line prosecutors is saying, man, I've got this guy, his 3rd felony is kind of shaky. He's not a dangerous guy. I don't think, this case really warrants an enhancement And so I'm not going to pursue it. That's a different story. I think prosecutors ought to, retain the discretion to make those kinds of calls on the job based on the individual facts in a given case. What I object to is this kind of blanket policy saying, no matter what the circumstances, we're not going to pursue these enhancements. No matter what the circumstances, we're not going to charge anyone for these crimes. No matter what the circumstances, we're not going to seek jail time for these crimes or bail for these crimes. That I think, crosses a line into policymaking that's unilateral, that's, counter-majoritarian in the worst sense, right? A lot of ways our Republican system of government is sort of built in these counter-majoritarian measures, but this is really taking that far, and you're placing a lot of power into the hands of a single office holder. And in this case, it's power that, when exercised, can have really serious consequences. I mean, LA, among a bunch of other cities around the country, are currently experiencing, pretty significant crime upticks. A lot of that serious violent crime, shootings, homicides, you see this in Chicago, especially, all the time. And Chicago has its own progressive prosecutor in Kim Foxx. But, you see these crimes, and when they actually catch the person, it seems like invariably that person's got this super long record, 25 arrests and 8 felony convictions or 9 felony convictions. And it gets to be pretty wild. So, yeah, I mean, even last year there was this case. I've talked about it a few times, but it's a case that really resonated with me for some reason. There's this really tragic homicide. This woman named Brittany Hill was killed. She's 24 years old, holding her 1-year-old daughter, standing in front of a house on the street, broad daylight. This car rolls to a stop in front of her and the 2 other guys that she was talking to, and they just opened fire. They didn't care that there was a baby there, and it just, this woman, Brittany Hill, was so heroic. I mean, she just turns and shields her daughter from the gunfire and is wounded twice, and just collapses in the street a few feet away, and she died. And the reason I can tell you these details is because the shooting was caught on video, and that video was leaked. And the video was from a camera that was placed by the Chicago Police Department. So they were able to track down the shooters in relatively quick order. I think they got them the same day. They could see the car, they could see their faces, etc. And one of the alleged shooters is a guy named Michael Washington. And I looked into his record. He's got 9 prior felony convictions, including one for second-degree murder, and was out on parole at the time. It's like, at what point, has someone gotten enough second chances? At what point can we say as a society that we're comfortable, taking an individual at their word through their behavior, that they have no intention of abiding by society's rules? So these decisions not to prosecute, these decisions not to seek jail time or prison time, they can have real consequences. Incapacitation is a valuable tool for law enforcement officials. And when you take that tool out of the tool belt, again, it's going to have downstream effects. And, we see it time and again, those effects are not, the downside risk isn't primarily falling on the shoulders of, the rich, white people living in Lakeview or Lincoln Park. It's the poor, low income, mostly minority communities, places like Austin or Garfield Park or Humboldt Park. That's where a lot of this violence is concentrated. And, that's where these guys are going to be hanging out if they're not inside. And, it's not to say that, every case that ever comes before a prosecutor's got to, get the book thrown at them. That's not the argument. But clearly, there's mounting evidence that we are leaving money on the proverbial table, so to speak, in the sense that we're not doing enough to go after, particularly the repeat players who probably shouldn't be on the street but are.
That is truly important information, and it's really nonpartisan. It highlights the problem that we have in the sense that I used to say that we don't want, I know I don't as a conservative, want a bunch of nonviolent offenders in jail. But it's nonviolent versus violent, I would say, but I was wrong. Even violent, even if you say violent versus violent, there's a difference between violent offenders or any type of offender who offends over and over and over and over again. So you have to do something with somebody who proves that they're not going to stop, harming citizens. and that's a skewed view of what nonviolent is. So we'll talk about that more with Rafael Mangual, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
And I just can't remember her name.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. We are playing an interview I did with Rafael Mangual, Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. And when we left, we were discussing the dangers of electing reformers, I say that with air quotes, like LA's new DA Gascon. And unfortunately, he's not alone. There has been a troubling trend across the country, whether it's in places like Chicago and Boston, or woke politicians like California Governor Newsom, or the recent comments from Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher about racism being a public health crisis. Elected officials are openly choosing sides, and they're picking a cultural fight, and they're choosing the side that will have a direct impact on crime. So what I wanted to say about the end of the last clip before we go to the third clip here is that I was talking about violent offenders and the people on the left skewing this information. And what they say is they have a different skewed view of what a nonviolent offender is. So if someone robs you at gunpoint, and they do a lot of robberies at gunpoint, and they strong arm rob you, but they never shoot you, some people say that that is nonviolent. So we have to pay attention to how they define some of these offenders. But not holding violent offenders is a problem because, most of these politicians run on something that sounds good, like bail reform. We're just trying to, help people get out of jail to await their trial, which in some ways is good. So I asked Rafael how bail reform creates issues for public policy. Here's his response.
Look, bail reform is an important topic because it's an issue where you have real liberty interests at stake. When we're talking about bail, we're talking about people who have not yet been convicted of the offense for which they're before the court. And so we ought to be very careful about how often and for how long we incarcerate these people who are presumed innocent. That said, the Supreme Court has been presented with this issue on multiple occasions, and in multiple occasions they have ruled that the Constitution is not offended by the temporary detention of a pretrial defendant if that defendant poses a high risk of danger to the community. And so this is another tool in the belt of law enforcement officers, in this case prosecutors, that they can use to keep dangerous people off the street. And so, my basic position on bail is that, the cash bail system, by making wealth the sort of primary consideration in pretrial release decisions, that's the wrong way to go about it. I think these decisions ought to be oriented around dangerousness. That ought to be the core concern that the court is looking at. If you don't pose danger to the community, you ought to be released with the minimal amount of conditions that will secure your return to court. Those conditions can be monetary in some cases. I don't think they necessarily should be. And there are plenty of alternative things that we can do. But I want to take a step back, because one of the reasons that bail reform had become such an issue is precisely because of how much time people stand to spend in pretrial detention, right? If the average stay in pretrial detention was 2 days, no one would be up in arms about it. But the reality is that our criminal justice system is incredibly underfunded, so that it becomes impossible to process a criminal case in any reasonable amount of time, which means that the pretrial detention period is going to be lengthy. Right, you've got people who are pretrial defendants for over a year while they're waiting for their case to get to trial and through trial. So one of the things that I've said in my writing on bail reform is that a lot of jurisdictions need to double or triple down on the funding for their criminal justice system. They need to hire more prosecutors. They need to hire more criminal court judges. They need to hire more public defenders, so that we have the capacity to actually meet the speedy trial requirements, so that we actually have the capacity to process these cases much quicker, and so that we can lower the potential harms of holding somebody pre-trial who turns out to be factually innocent in a given case. But again, having said all that, there is a pretty sizable subset of defendants who, have received enough due process through a probable cause finding, et cetera, for the court to be able to justify a brief period of pretrial detention on the grounds that they are dangerous. New York, for example, underwent a pretty significant bail reform, essentially ending cash bail for most offenses. But it did that while maintaining a prohibition on courts being able to consider dangerousness as a factor in release decisions at any stage of a release decision. So courts can't consider the danger you pose to society in New York when they're talking about what conditions, even non-monetary conditions, to place on your release. So what pretrial supervision, an ankle monitor, check-ins, etc. Like dangerousness cannot come into the consideration at all at any stage of the pretrial release decisions. And they did that at the same time. They expanded the size of the population that would be eligible for pretrial release. Now, in Chicago, they expanded the population that would be eligible for pretrial release. But at least in theory, Chicago judges have the ability to remand defendants that they see as dangerous and hold them on those grounds during the pretrial period. Now, the problem is that obviously that's a lever that's not being pulled often enough. And there have been some analyses of the effects of bail reform in Chicago, done by the Chicago Tribune, Paul Cassell at the University of Utah. And what they found is that, what we've seen with bail reform in Chicago is that while, judges have this ability, they are still releasing a lot of dangerous people who go on to commit more crimes. And so there's been a significant uptick in the number of crimes committed by pretrial defendants. And so, what's frustrating for me about this debate is like you've seen some of the studies on the other side. And what they do is they try to kind of obfuscate the issue. They'll look at bail reform in Chicago. There's a recent study that looked at it. But the basic takeaway was that bail reform in Chicago is not jeopardizing public safety because the recidivism rate hasn't changed. So the pretrial detention population that's been released, pretrial releasees, are committing offenses at no higher rate than they were before. And that's true. But that misunderstands the nature of the critique of the bail reform. The critique is not that bail reform will cause pretrial defendants to start committing crimes at higher rates. It's that when you have a bigger population of pretrial releasees, even if the percentage of that population that reoffends remains constant, that still translates to more offenses that would not have otherwise occurred. And so, these are all things that I think we need to think about, especially when you consider that, the role that repeat offenders play in the most serious violent crime categories. And there was a study done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics that looked at violent felony convicts in the 75 largest counties over a 12-year period. And what they found was that more than a third of those violent felons they committed their offense either while they were on bail, on parole, or on probation. And so all that to say that, repeat offending is a significant problem in some jurisdictions more than others. I would put Chicago in the former category.
So obviously the left has hijacked the term criminal justice reform. I went on to ask Rafael what he thought some good reforms should be.
Yeah, no, it's such a strange phrase because it's changed in meaning so much. I mean, when I started my career, I was pretty widely considered to be a reformer, right? The topic that I started writing about was overcriminalization, legislative and regulatory overcriminalization. It's basically a problem that exists not just at the federal level, but also at the state level, one that the Manhattan Institute has done a lot of work documenting. One of the reasons why I was so attracted, to the Manhattan Institute to begin with when I was in law school. But basically at the federal level, just to kind of give you an idea of the scope of the problem, we don't actually know how many crimes exist. There's no one in the world who could tell you how many federal crimes exist in the United States. It's not because no one's tried. It's not because no one's interested in getting at the answer. It's because there are so many, and that number grows at such a rapid pace that it is impossible to keep count. The best estimates are that there are more than 300,000 criminally enforceable federal rules and regulations that you could potentially be prosecuted for. And that's a problem, especially when you consider the fact that about 98% of those are regulations, criminally enforceable regulations, which means that these are things that not a single elected representative actually voted on, right? So the way it works, right, is that Congress will pass this, really broad omnibus bill of some sort that gives rulemaking authority to some body, the EPA or the FTC or whatever. And then there'll be this little throwaway line called a regulatory catch-all provision that'll say something like, in addition to granting rulemaking authority to the FTC, basically it'll say that any violation of any rule promulgated pursuant to this grant of authority shall be a misdemeanor or shall be a felony punishable by, 5 days in jail to 30 days in jail or 60 days, whatever the penalty is, or $10,000 in fine. But then what happens is that every rule that the FTC then creates after the fact is functionally a crime.
More with Rafael Mangual, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Nothing else matters.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are playing an interview I did with Rafael Mangual earlier in this week. He is the Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. Give us a call at 312-642-5600 and tell us how you feel about extreme criminal justice reform. Are they helping the people they claim to care about? When we left, Rafael was explaining how government has inadvertently created crimes out of normal behavior without most of us even knowing it. He continues his explanation here.
So you were essentially criminalizing behavior preemptively without knowing what behavior is going to be set out. That was a problem that just jumped out to me as like outrageous. It's like, that's not how the government should work. And, so that's an important criminal justice reform that I think doesn't get enough attention, especially when you consider the fact that so many of those crimes don't have any intent requirement. Traditionally, most crimes you have to prove that the person did a bad act, but that they also knew that they were doing a bad act or should have known. Everyone knows, that assaulting somebody is bad. But very few people know that it is a federal crime to walk your dog on a leash longer than 6 feet on federal property. So, that's an example of a reform, that I kind of started my career getting behind. But I slowly made the transition into more kind of traditional street crime and issues of policing and incarceration, because within the overcriminalization conversation, so many allies, people with whom I was working, were conflating this issue with like, quote unquote, mass incarceration. And the reality is that, while overcriminalization is a serious problem, most people are not going to jail for any of these offenses, right? Even the ones that get prosecuted, you're not, the same like 10 or 11 offenses have basically accounted for like more than 90% of the prison population for the last 50 years. And so, bail reform is another example. Like, I'm for bail reform. I think the bail system in jurisdictions that are heavily cash bail systems needs to be reformed. I think it's wrong to create a system in which a wealthy but dangerous defendant gets to buy his pretrial freedom while a poor but harmless defendant gets stuck behind bars. We ought to reorient that inquiry around dangerousness. But I also think that there are reforms on the other side that would make the system harsher. Reform has now kind of become synonymous with leniency, right? So reform is a sort of unidirectional term now. It doesn't contemplate, some of the reforms that were enacted in the early 90s or late 80s that increased the harshness for certain kinds of crimes or for criminals, right? With 3 strikes enhancements or mandatory minimums for gun possession or, other kinds of offenses. So, it is kind of a frustrating debate to have because, the term has kind of been co-opted in a way. I mean, I think of myself as a reformer in a lot of ways. In other ways, I obviously push back against what I see are the excesses of the reform movement. But it is an important discussion to have and an important discussion to have soberly. This is really my biggest thing. It's like, you can make a really good rhetorical case for a lot of these reforms, but that's usually where everything stops. What I do, where I concern myself is with the question of what is the impact of this going to be on net? Are we going to be better off for this? On net, are we going to be safer for this? And by we, I say we as like society, but it's really not all of society, right? I mean, the vast majority of the American public lives in a very safe place. If you were to be, randomly dropped over the United States by parachute, chances are you're going to land in a place with a murder rate close to zero. If you repeat that experiment 10,000 times over, the unlucky people will land in places like, Austin or Englewood, where the murder rate is probably closer to 50 or 60 or 70 per 100,000. For context, the national murder rate's about 5 per 100,000. So yeah, I mean, it's really a problem that, again, falls on the shoulders of a select few people who are usually falling into the category of our most vulnerable citizens, right? People who are living in economically distressed communities and underserved communities with, that suffer from poor schools and a lack of investment and a lack of businesses and community organizations and high rates of broken families, communities that essentially have enough to deal with. You don't need to pile on the impact of more violent crime because it is stunting. And the impact of violent crime goes way further than just the victim of a given shooting, right? There are studies that show that school-age children perform worse on standardized tests if there is a shooting within, a certain radius of where they live compared to kids who live outside that radius. That kind of exposure to trauma actually will affect the chemistry of your brain over time, right? I mean, think about it. It's really hard to get a kid for whom his peers are regularly dying before the age of 21 to think long-term about, what he or she needs to do, in biology class this semester in order to set his or herself up for college. How can you think in long-term if you're worried about survival? And that's who I have in mind.
That's important. And I think that there is a push to try to fix things, but no one's really focusing on the actual problem there and what will actually make things better. As we continue with Rafael Mangual, the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute, we will talk more about that coming up. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are continuing our interview with Rafael Mangual, Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. And we were discussing how many people are pursuing bad policy because it feels good and what the ramifications of those types of behaviors are. And I say that too many people are just saying, like they do on a lot of issues, just do something. Like if you do anything that will help, or everything is racist. So I asked Rafael, what are the consequences of bad reforms? And I gave him some examples like BLM. Their idea of reform is to get rid of surveillance, all surveillance, even in public areas, or just letting violent prisoners out of jail, certain age dilemmas, age parameters and all kind of things. Just let them empty in the jails, and they think that will help crime. And this is his response.
Right. Saying we're not going to have people in jail for those crimes, saying that, even for the crimes that most people agree you should go to prison for, we're going to advocate for and pursue much shorter sentences so that those people find themselves back in the neighborhood in a shorter period of time. We are going to, in Brooklyn, for example, the progressive DA there, Eric Gonzalez, his office has adopted a default position of supporting parole bids for those convicted by his office, which means, rather than stay silent or speak in opposition to a prisoner's early release, the Brooklyn DA will now, give their imprimatur of support, for an early release. So, it really does. I mean, the decarceration movement has gained a lot of momentum, and it comes in many forms. Bail reform is just one of those forms. Seeking to adopting non-prosecution policies for certain crimes is another. Sort of capping the sentences that will be sought is yet another. Supporting parole is yet another. So. Yeah, I mean, it's really a battle that's being fought on multiple fronts, which makes it hard to defend against in some ways. But yeah, I mean, it is frustrating. You talked about, Black Lives Matter, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, because the irony is that the communities in whose name they are making these demands, like defund the police, those are the communities that are going to stand to suffer the most if it turns out that pulling those policy levers, was not the right move. And I think that the overwhelming body of evidence supports the idea that that's exactly what's going to happen. That you defund the police and you're going to end up with more crime, right? I mean, one of the most sort of robust bodies of literature in the social sciences, it shows that police have an enormous impact of crime on crime. Simply putting police officers on the street, even if they don't do anything, their mere presence has been shown to have crime reducing effects. And so, yeah, I mean, it really is frustrating to see, because I think the most frustrating thing about it, and a point that I kind of raised at the end of the piece that we started talking about on Gascon, is like, these are all things that we're continuing to move toward as a society with greater and greater speed, despite the fact that early indications seem to show that things are getting worse, right? We've got a crime uptick, in Chicago, for example, homicides are up 55%, 53% year over year, somewhere in that range. Shootings up about the same. And this is from an already elevated level compared to a lot of other cities. New York is in almost at a 40% homicide increase, almost 100% increase in shootings. St. Louis, Houston, and the list goes on. Louisville, I think, just set a record for homicides. Baltimore last year set a record for homicide rate. This is beyond the worst years of the 1990s. And yet we continue to double down. People continue to vote in, progressive prosecutors like Gascon, who show no real interest in talking about the crime problem as a crime problem, show no real interest in considering policies. Sure.
So I went on to say the other problem with the reformers is that they act as if criminals are too stupid to take advantage of these reduced punishments. Make the threshold for arrest $1,000 instead of $500, and there's no way criminals would be smart enough to keep their theft at $950. I mean, it's silly. And here's Rafael's response.
Yeah, there's this kind of incongruity in the rhetoric, particularly when we talk about things like deterrence, right? On the one hand, you hear a lot about these crimes of poverty, right? A lot of the reforms are trying to adopt non-prosecution policies as to crimes of poverty. And when you hear that phrase, the implicit argument there is that, if people had more opportunities, if people had more employment, if people had higher levels of education, then they would have better options than criminality, right? Criminality is attractive by virtue of the absence of all these other potentially socially positive tracks. But that's basically the same mechanics of a deterrence argument, right? And because you're saying that these people are responding to the lack of incentives to put them on a different track. Well, you can change the incentive structure from both sides of the equation, right? So it's if you believe that the root causes of crime are socioeconomic in nature, well, then there's no reason to believe that it's only a job that a potential offender would respond to, right? You can change the calculation on the other side by affecting how long they stand to be punished for that, right? You can change the how much the potential payoff is by changing the penalty.
Coming up, our final segment with Rafael Mangual, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Well, that's true. You like me and I like you.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. This is our final segment with Rafael Mangual, Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute, discussing criminal justice reforms. So I asked Rafael if he believes, like me, that the reformers are focused on the wrong thing. If they are right that jobs and incomes are the problem, they should be focusing on improving those things rather than calling everything racist or just, saying let the people out. So they have the wrong focus. So the focusing on the root cause would be better than what feels good. His response.
Right. And on top of that, though, too, I mean, if we're going to talk about root causes, we have to talk about violence, too, as a root cause, right? The exposure to that kind of trauma is going to have an impact on how somebody's life, proceeds after that exposure. If you have, a criminal parent, say a dad who is violent and gets drunk and, beats mom in front of the kids or whatever it is, that's going to have an impact on the outcomes of that kid too. And I wrote this essay a while back, just raising the question of like, are we right to assume in all cases that the incarceration of a parent or a sibling is always a net negative for kids? Maybe you can spare that kid exposure to trauma that parent might have otherwise exposed them to. And, in that essay, I talked about this story. There was a video that went viral. I don't know if you remember it. I think it was last summer or the summer before. Everything kind of blends together now in the age of COVID. But, there was this family in Disneyland, and it's a Black family, and they got into this huge brawl. It was like an intra-family brawl where, this guy was arguing with his sister, and then she spit in his face, and then he started punching her, and then he started squaring off with her boyfriend, and then his girlfriend and his sister started fighting. And meanwhile, in all this melee, there's like these kids in a stroller there who were with this family, and they're screaming and crying, and it's like just of course one of the guys had like a long criminal history, and so it's like just gives you a sense of what some of these kids might get exposed to. And that's what inspired me to start looking into some of the research. And what you find is that we talk a lot about two-parent households and the importance of that. And I would note that at least up until recently, the Black Lives Matter website put opposition to the nuclear family among their sort of policy agenda items, which I thought was interesting. For all the talk about the importance of two-parent households, there's a caveat there, which is that it's beneficial to have both parents present, assuming that both parents are pro-social forces, right? So the absence of a pro-social parent will do harm to a child, but the presence of an antisocial parent, particularly a father, and particularly on the outcomes for a young boy, will be significantly worse than the absence of a pro-social parent. And so, the question that you have to sort of raise to yourself is like, all right, well, when we're talking about incarceration and criminal justice, are the people who tend to find themselves in jail and prison, which category do they fall into most likely? Are they, these pro-social people, or are they more likely to be people who engage in high levels of antisocial behavior? And what you find is that antisocial personality disorder is an incredibly common diagnosis within correctional settings.
And so we finished with Rafael with some solutions. And what do we do?
We need to better fund our police departments. We need more police officers. I mean, the hiring and recruitment and retention crisis in police forces around the country is real. Reinforcing those agencies is going to do a lot to keep crime under control. We need to focus our carceral resources on repeat offenders, keep them behind bars for much longer than we're currently doing. We need to approach reforms like bail reform, et cetera, incrementally. We have to understand that people's lives are literally at risk. And, if we start pulling all these policy levers at the same time, that cat gets really hard to get back into the bag. The people left holding that bag are going to be the most vulnerable among us.
He is Rafael Mangual, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor to the City Journal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me back, Charles.